Welcome to the Mom in Mind podcast. I am your host, Dr. Kat, and this is another episode of Behind the Sessions, where I dig in to some of the things that people bring up in therapy. And I'm talking specifically folks who are coming to therapy related to perinatal mental health. And there are quite a few issues and challenges that people deal with during pregnancy, birth, loss, and postpartum. And some of those things really impact this transition into parenthood in very significant ways. And when that happens to us, it leaves a mark, it leaves some residue. It is something that we didn't expect to be going through, definitely didn't want to go through. Yet here we are. We've dealt with a really significant thing in our life that's beyond just having a baby or trying to have a baby. I'm talking about very significant, unexpected life changes, mental health challenges that nobody wants to have during this time. And most people are blindsided by the fact that they are experiencing a perinatal mental health condition that is life changing, that is impacting their transition into parenthood. And when you've been through something so significant and so jarring for a lot of people, it changes how you are in the world. It certainly can. It might change how you are with yourself. It might change how you are with your family or your spouse or your friends, sometimes in significant ways and sometimes in more subtle ways. But what it can also do is impact how you return to work and the things you need to consider for yourself as you return to work after a perinatal mental health condition. Now, a lot of people, even for those who had a relatively easy pregnancy, birth, postpartum, all of that, people still have challenges returning to work after having a baby. It's a pretty significant life change. And some people really would rather stay home with their baby. And some people have a really hard time with the returning to work process, being away from their baby and getting back into the groove of just a 9 to 5, if that's what you've got. Other people are happy to return to work and need that kind of structure and stimulation of talking to adults and doing the thing that they used to love to do and really enjoy being back in the work environment. That's not to say they don't also have difficulty with the transition, but I'm naming that to say people's experiences are varied, and it's okay to want to return to work. It's okay to not want to return to work, and everything in between. You can have mixed feelings. Some days you can be glad to go, some days you can be sad that you have to go back. All of it is okay. There is nothing good or bad or negative or great about any way that this is panning out for you. There's often times where people are even surprised that they want to go back to work or surprised that they don't want to go back to work. You never really know what it's going to feel like for you, what your needs are going to be until you're there and needing to make that decision, or you're there and you don't have a choice. You have to go back. These are significant moments in our lives, both the having a baby or spending weeks or months going to the NICU and then also having to go to work at the same time. Oh, there's so many different ways that people have to deal with returning to work, and with many, many different types of challenges or roadblocks or things to consider. So, one of those things to consider is, how are you actually doing? How is your mental health? Are you in a space where you feel like you can work? And I put it that way because oftentimes, most of the time, with a perinatal mental health condition, you've had difficulty concentrating, you've had a hard time with focus or task completion or brain fog, you've had difficulty sleeping, or you've been so worried and so anxious you've been preoccupied, or you just feel like not yourself and out of sorts. And too often, I'll just speak for the US, too often, people are forced to go back into the workplace while they still feel that way. And I think, well, I have a lot of soapbox type complaints and issues about how we treat working parents and people who are returning to the workforce after pregnancy or loss or postpartum, whatever, again, whatever the combination of factors are for you. We don't do parents any favors, really. You're lucky if you get 6 weeks in many places, and you're lucky if you have baby bonding time that takes you even farther than that. The reality is that a lot of people don't have a choice, and they have to return to work even though they are not feeling um, like they can. What I will say is if you can find a provider, whether that be an OB or a psychologist or a therapist who has a psychologist as a supervisor or a psychologist on practice or an MD on practice who has authority to write you off of work for disability, then find those providers. Because if you are actually having difficulty functioning, if you are suffering with depression or anxiety or OCD or PTSD, or any of the perinatal mental health conditions, you returning to work when you're not well just makes you more not well. I haven't yet run across somebody who's gone to work when they weren't doing well and got better while they were working. Not without significant stress or a long drawn out period of time where their symptoms, their just how they're doing, their overall well-being maybe got better a little bit over time. But if you are really suffering, this is a medical condition. This is real. It is. You're not making it up. I would never send you back to a marathon or even a long walk with a broken leg. So why would I send you back to work when you are literally dealing with a medical condition that is incapacitating you? So there are providers who can do assessments to, see where you're at in your symptoms. Are you having still severe symptoms? Are your symptoms improving? Are your symptoms mild enough that you're better able to function and you can withstand returning to work and, having a new stressor introduced? These are very worthwhile considerations. And, like I said, unfortunately, sometimes just our standard old medical leave for vaginal or C-section births, 6 or 8 weeks, is just not enough. We know this. It is not enough. And just the fact that people have to think about returning to work when they can barely get through the day or just having so much difficulty functioning throughout the day, I just think is insulting. It's insulting to people who've given birth. It's insulting to mothers. But why are we doing this? It drives me nuts. But I hear about it all the time, so it happens all the time. It's also a disservice to those babies. It's a disservice to the families. It puts an unimaginable amount of stress on families to force them to return to work, not only just kind of prematurely like we already do, but also when they're suffering significantly. So some OBs are happy to assess and provide extensions for people to be on medical leave. And sometimes you need a mental health professional or a psychiatrist who does those assessments. The point is, ask around, ask your providers, your medical providers, to be assessed and to see if perinatal mental health condition is at a level where medical necessity is met, that so that you can stay off of work and continue to search for healing and get better. Okay, so let's say you have had the time off that you need and you are thinking about returning to work. I suggest planning ahead, especially because, oftentimes the transition back to work People can feel anxious and worried about the return. Like, what is that going to look like? What am I going to have to tell people? Who's going to ask questions? And am I going to be okay returning to work? These are really common, normal, reasonable questions. You've just, especially if you've just been through one of the more difficult things in your life, and you're returning to your capacity, your ability to feel like that, yeah, you can remember things now, and you can focus and whatnot, then you're going to go back into a work environment where you are going to have to figure out how to deal with a new set of demands, essentially. Even if it's a job you've already had, even if it's a job you already know how to do, you're going back into that job as a different person, as a person who's recovering from something, and also as a person who's just dealt with a perinatal mental health condition and might still have a baby at home to think about and care for. You might also need to be figuring out pumping. If you're a nursing parent, then when are you going to pump? How are you going to pump? Where are you going to pump? When are those breaks going to be? Who's going to, be a part of that decision making? Unfortunately, somebody might have to be a part of that decision making. And that's just one of the considerations of returning to work. What I'll say is this: if it were up to me, I would have people who are recovering from a perinatal mental health condition and who are returning back to work do so kind of slowly. So for at least a couple of weeks, this is how I like to set things up anyways, for at least a couple of weeks, if possible, to return to work part-time, or to arrange your hours in a way that fit with you easing back into work. Granted, this is not available everywhere, but it's worthwhile to ask. It's worthwhile to see if this is a possibility at your place of work. Part of the reason I think this is a good idea, both for the parent returning to the work and also the employer, is that the transition can be smoother. So if you're returning to work and you're going back full time, just out of the gate, sometimes people can have an increased level of stress that makes it harder for them to get back into the flow of work. So easing back in can both help the employee get back into the flow of things, and the employer be able to have the employee actually be able to function and not have to, go back out on leave for too much stress too soon. Again, I'm making some generalizations. This is my ideal world, how I would set it up. Even if you can't go back to work part-time, slow and steady is better. So what I mean by that is, if you are the person who's going back to work, you don't have to put pressure on yourself to jump back in and go full steam right away. Don't walk through the door and take on a bunch of projects. Don't walk into a meeting and start deciding you'll be on this committee or that committee and taking up all of these causes as soon as you walk back in. I think it's important to note this because sometimes when people have been out of work, they feel like guilty for, I don't know, to their employer or to their coworkers for having been out, and they can feel like they need to sort of make up for being gone. I'm here to call that out. I'm here to say, don't do that. And this is going to sound harsh, but most companies will use up your energy as soon as you give it to them. So it's up to you to pace yourself and to give yourself that courtesy that you are easing back into something that, even if you love it and you love this work, you're still in a transition. And you've been in transitions from this whole process. The whole perinatal time is a whole transition, and this is another one. Transitions take time, and you don't get back into the groove of things right away. It takes time to get back into the groove of things. So let's just take that pressure off the top and go in with some ease. So, like, if you are somebody who tends to show up at 100% all of the time, maybe knock it down to 80 if you can tolerate it. Maybe knock it down to 50% effort. This is not meant to be forever, just in this transitional phase while you're getting back into work. Again, like even if just for the first week. I'm going to again use the analogy of if you've had a broken leg and you haven't been able to walk, you're not going to get up and start running right away. You're going to ease back into whatever exercise you're trying to do. So this is the same thing. Just walk for a little bit, a slow leisurely walk for a little bit until you get your legs up under you and you feel like you have a little bit more stamina and you're a little more used to being back in the work environment and doing the work that you were doing. So allowing yourself that time to adjust is really important because you're trying to retrain your muscles to do that walking, to use the analogy. So you may be tired when you first go back to work, and like using your brain in that way, getting up at a new time of day to get back into work. You might be overstimulated by, I don't know, the thousands of emails that you have to check, or a bunch of people coming up to you, even well-intentioned and well-meaning people. Oh, Susie, it's been so long. We're so happy to have you back. Like all that stuff is cool, but it still has an impact on you, especially if you've been out of it for a while. The overstimulation from just kind of, conversations and figuring stuff out again and learning like what new rules were implemented while you were gone and whatever else it is. That is part of the allowing yourself time to adjust, so that you can, again, not get overwhelmed right away. Just even naming it for yourself that, okay, I'm going back to work. This is a transition. I'm going to need time to adjust. I don't need to hit the ground running. All of that can help you pace yourself before you even walk in the door. And for you, it might be useful to think through what your needs might be as you return to work, and give yourself a space to not know what your needs are. You might be figuring it out as you go, day to day, what those things are. But taking inventory of that as you go along is really important because it can give you the space, the mental space that you need so that you can take stock and take notice of how work is affecting you and impacting you. That's like having little check-ins with yourself throughout the day, or at least once a day. How did that go today? What do I need to shift for tomorrow? What could be a little bit different so that I'm not as overstimulated? Um, Maybe you need like an exit strategy for conversations. Like, you might not want to talk to everybody all the time. So excusing yourself to the restroom and having some kind of out like that. Oh, I forgot something at my car. Those little things that you can say to people that are not rude. It's just a way to state that, for yourself, to acknowledge to yourself that you need a little bit of space. Another thing to note on your return to work is that your priorities may have shifted. So the things you might have held up as a, let's say, number one priority in your working life might have shifted. And that, this can look a lot of different ways. So you'll have to check in with yourself about that. But you may have a baby at home. You may be considering, well, just so many different things. So it is common and normal for things to feel a little bit different, for work even to not feel as important to you as it might have once felt. And that's normal, and that's okay. Life changes things, life changes us, and we're not gonna always be the same person that we were when we first, started that job. We might not even like that work anymore. It can be that different of a priority, that much of a shift. And so that is something to consider and take stock of when you're there. Don't put pressure on yourself for things to be the same as they were when you were last at work. There just has to be space and flexibility for things to be different. And that's just kind of talking about the work itself, but Other things that can change are your specific needs at work. Those things might have shifted too. Like you might really need to make sure that you take your lunch. If you were somebody who worked through lunch before and that was fine for you, that might not be fine for you anymore. You might need to attend to your own self in different ways at work. And so the process here is just to notice, just as you return to work, you're back in that environment, just paying attention to, being intentional about paying attention to how your needs have shifted, how they're different, what your priorities are. And that also doesn't need to be set in stone. You could need to be noticing those things for a couple of weeks and then you're right as rain. You're like ready to go. Things are like just like how they used to be. So there's no prescriptive way that this is supposed to look. It can be any way that you need it to be, but these are really important things to think through and consider as you're returning. There are a couple of other really useful points, and these are things that I talk to people about as they're returning to work after a perinatal mental health condition that is important to talk through because you don't know until you know. And so I think it's great to have these kind of preparation conversations as much as possible to help people ease their transition back into the workplace. One of my top tips for people when they're returning to work is to think about how they want to go from home to work and from work back home. The reason for this is that when you're at home and you're doing all the home things, all the caregiving things, you're in an environment where your heart is open, your vulnerability is open, you're relatively safe, relatively comfortable, and you're in caregiving mode for the most part. And when you go into work, that requires a different skill set, different intentions. It most likely is better for you to not to be in a vulnerable space, in an open, caregiving, lovey-dovey headspace and heart space. So having a boundary, having a practice of something that you can do that takes you from home to work and then work to home is very important in keeping those boundaries there and also helping with overstimulation not leaking over as much into one or the other place. And this can be true for you whether you commute down the hall to go to your home office or you commute by a car or train or bus and you're going somewhere else to go to work. Your practice can look something like simply just sitting for a minute and telling yourself, okay, I'm leaving home and I'm going to leave home stuff at home and I'm going to work and I'm going to put on my work hat, so to speak. Like you're getting into work mentality. It can be that simple, but something to signify the transition to say, I'm leaving this and going to that. And the skills that I use at home are not the skills that I use or need at work. Maybe they are. There might be some overlap, especially if you're in a caregiving type of profession. But even with that, the boundary is important. It's a different type of caregiving. It's not as open and vulnerable and lovey and mushy when you're going to work as it is when you're home with kids. You can make it a little bit more complex or as complex as you need it to be to signify to yourself that there's a transitional space here. You can take another minute and do some deep breathing. You can take a minute and do some intention setting for, let's say, if you're going from home to work and what you want to feel like or what you want your day to be like in the workspace. And you can get creative with it. This is your journey. It's your transition from your home to your work. So it's going to be unique to what your needs are. Equally as important is the return from work to home. Again, you're commuting down the hall or by bus or car back to home. You can use that time to set your intention for what you want your home experience to be when you return there. For yourself, I'm not necessarily setting you up to have expectations for what's going to happen, at night when you get home or what kind of mood everybody's going to be in when you get there, but just that you are intending to leave work stuff behind. You're heading into a home environment where you do want to be intentional about being there. You want to be thoughtful about what kind of energy you bring into the home for yourself. And again, it can be anything you need it to be. You can take deep breaths. You can listen to like heavy metal music and scream all the way home. You can listen to calm, soothing music. You could listen to a podcast that is like nothing to do with home or work. It can be whatever you need. It doesn't need to be the same thing every day, or it can be. If you find that you have a habit or a practice that really works well for you to distinguish home from work and work from home, then cool. The point being is that you're trying to not sort of like bleed over emotionally into either space, and have as much boundaries with it as possible. And there are going to be days where that's just harder to do. It's You're not a robot. Things are going to happen where you've had a tough morning, or you've had a tough day at work, and stuff sort of bleeds through. I'm talking about like a general practice that can help you, at least in the beginning, when you are going back to work initially. And last but not least, never least, is sleep. So once people start going back to work, that kind of feeling of, oh, I've been working all day and then I get home and I have to do kids stuff or care for people or do these things. I just need time for myself. It's a compelling reason to stay up and stay up late and whatever, play games on your phone or scroll on social media or whatever it is that you do. And that's fine. You're totally going to need that. You are absolutely going to need those nights where you stay up and do whatever random thing you want to do, or your hobbies, or your whatever, things you like to do. Great. I'm a proponent of having those days, as long as it is also balanced with having days where you are also prioritizing your sleep. So, just like with anything else, the more days a week you have where you're going to bed late and waking up early, the worse you're going to feel. You don't need to have a baby or go through any perinatal mental health condition for that to be true. That's just always going to be true. So if you can negotiate with yourself to have ideally 4 of those days out of the week where you are prioritizing sleep, at least on average, then great. Then you will be able to sustain the return to work much more easily if you are also getting the rest that you need. And that might be a more simple task to do when you first start going back to work, because you'll probably automatically be tired from just doing the new thing again and getting back into the groove. But in order for it to be sustainable for any of us, making sure that there are several nights a week where sleep is prioritized, so that you can just maintain your basic functional needs, which is what sleep does for us. We just need it. There's no way around it. And then those other nights where you decide to stay up later and do whatever it is that you're going to do, cool. Then you also don't have to feel bad for staying up. There's this downside to staying up late all the time, is the conversation that happens in your head of like, oh my gosh, I should really get to sleep. I stayed up late. I'm going to be so tired in the morning. It would be much better if you're going to allow yourself to stay up and do your random stuff or do your hobby, whatever it is, to do that guilt-free. And I don't mean guilt like you should feel bad about it. I'm talking like guilt, like guilty pleasure. That's what I mean. Like, that you need sleep, but you stay up too late anyways. That's what I mean. So if you have those other nights prioritized and you're getting the sleep that you need, then cool. You just have those other nights where you're up too late. No problem. So I hope this has been helpful to talk through some of the things to consider when you're returning to work, some of the tools you can use to ease your transition into work, and really food for thought so that you can be reflective, you can be intentional about your return to work so that you can feel as good as possible and ideally not have a resurgence of symptoms of stress and anxiety and depression, because you won't be pushing yourself too hard. This is a conversation that comes up in therapy, is how am I going to return to work? It can feel so overwhelming. And it is another transition, as I said before, on top of multiple transitions that came before it. But it's an important one. And I really hope that this has been useful for you. And please do come and find the Mom and Mind podcast, follow, subscribe, all the things so that you can get all these episodes downloaded to you, and share this episode. Share it with somebody who is going to be returning to work after a perinatal mental health condition, or even after having a baby and they were seemingly fine. These are things that can be useful for everyone, but in particular, my perinatal mental health folks. I hold you dearly in my heart. I was you. I know how hard this can be, and I know how important it is to take care of yourself. Thanks for being with me. Until next time.